February 14th, 1943. Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. The desert wind howled, kicking up dust and sand as the battle raged on in the heart of Tunisia. It was a grim, endless fight with both sides locked in a bitter struggle for control. The Allies, under the command of General Montgomery, were beginning to make their push after months of stalemate. The German Afrika Korps, already stretched thin, were trying to hold the line with what little they had left. The rumble of tanks, the crackle of gunfire, and the distant whine of aircraft overhead filled the air. In the midst of the chaos, a group of Wehrmacht soldiers advanced toward the wreckage of a disabled American convoy. It had been a brutal engagement, but amidst the debris, there were new opportunities. The convoy, which had been transporting essential supplies and equipment, had been decimated by a series of precision strikes. As the German forces combed through the wreckage, the soldiers stumbled upon something unexpected: intact American radios. The equipment, though battered from the battle, was strangely unharmed. These radios were more than just functional. They were sophisticated pieces of military technology. Sergeant Fritz Weber, one of the soldiers tasked with securing the wreckage, approached the radios cautiously. He had seen plenty of American equipment before: M1 rifles, jeeps, and other vehicles, but these radios stood out. Unlike the crude, bulky German models he was used to, these devices were sleek, compact, and designed with precision. There was something about them that felt different, more advanced. Weber's curiosity piqued. He called over his commanding officer, Lieutenant Hans Müller, to take a closer look. Müller, a seasoned officer with a keen eye for detail, crouched beside the radios, inspecting them carefully. He had seen American radios in passing, but had never encountered anything quite like these. The design was striking. The SCR-508 tank radio in particular stood out due to its robust construction and ease of operation. It was unlike the cumbersome, unreliable communication systems they used. Müller's mind raced as he recognized the potential importance of this find. These weren't just radios. They were tools of war vital to the coordination of American forces. The radios were collected quickly, and a report was sent to German command. A request for engineers to analyze the equipment was put in motion. The Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe had their own radio systems, but the Army's communications were crucial to battlefield success, and the discovery of these radios could not be ignored. If the radios worked as well as they seemed, it could change how they thought about American technology, their tactics, and ultimately the war itself. Back at the German command center, engineers and technicians were waiting. The equipment, still warm from battle, was unpacked and carefully set up for examination. These American radios were to be scrutinized with the precision that only the finest German minds could offer. But as the engineers started their work, they quickly realized they were dealing with something they had not anticipated: radios that were far more advanced than any they had ever encountered. As the engineers began testing the captured SCR-508, they marveled at its clarity and durability. The Americans had engineered a radio that could withstand the brutal conditions of the battlefield. The Germans had been forced to rely on radios that were often plagued by interference, poor reception, and mechanical failure under stress. These new radios, however, seemed to function flawlessly under the harshest conditions. Even more striking was the ease of use. There were no complicated adjustments or lengthy setup procedures. The radios were designed to keep soldiers connected, no matter how dire the situation. The American system, which relied on frequency modulation FM, was also a revelation. FM radios were more reliable and resistant to the interference that plagued the German shortwave radios. The clarity of the signals was shocking, allowing for smooth communication across great distances. The Germans, on the other hand, were still using longwave radios, which were much more prone to signal degradation and could be easily disrupted by the interference caused by weather or the terrain. The difference in communication quality could be the difference between life and death on the battlefield. As the hours ticked by, the German engineers continued their assessment of the radios. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie, another key piece of American technology, was even more revealing. It was lightweight, portable, and effective in maintaining communication between individual soldiers in the field. The German radio systems, by contrast, were bulky and cumbersome, often requiring a vehicle to transport them. The mobility that the Americans had integrated into their communication systems was a game-changer. These radios allowed for swift communication at the most crucial moments, giving the Americans an edge in battlefield coordination. The German technicians began to realize the full scope of what they were dealing with. The captured radios were a window into the American war machine's industrial and technological superiority. This wasn't just a matter of better equipment, it was a matter of scale. The United States was mass-producing these devices at an unimaginable rate. While the Germans struggled to keep up with their own limited production capacity, the Americans were outfitting entire divisions with advanced communication systems. This level of industrial output could not be matched, and it was becoming increasingly clear that it would be a decisive factor in the outcome of the war. In the coming days, more equipment was captured from the wreckage. More radios, more vehicles, more signs that the Americans had a level of coordination and communication that the Germans simply couldn't replicate. The engineers were left in awe of the scale at which these technologies were produced. The German war effort, with all its precision and craftsmanship, was no match for the American industrial machine. The realization slowly began to sink in. The Germans were facing an enemy whose capacity for innovation, production, and technological superiority far outstripped their own. The discovery of the American radios was more than just a military intelligence victory, it was a revelation. For the first time, the Germans understood that their adversary was not just winning battles on the ground, they were outproducing them at every turn. And this, more than anything, would be the key to the Allies' ultimate victory. As the engineers continued their work, one thought lingered in their minds. The battle for North Africa might have been a single turning point, but the real war was already being decided back in factories across the Atlantic. March 1st, 1943. Tunis, Tunisia. The soft glow of fluorescent lights illuminated the cluttered workshop. The heavy scent of oil, metal, and soldered circuits filled the air as Oberingenieur Klaus Hermann carefully adjusted his glasses. He had spent hours inspecting the captured American radios, but now he needed to conduct a more thorough examination. Each radio was laid out in front of him, the once pristine equipment now scarred by the chaos of battle. The SCR-508, SCR-300, and SCR-299 were all present, their intricate designs speaking volumes about the technical prowess behind them. But Hermann knew that the true test lay in the inner workings. The Germans had a strong tradition of engineering excellence. Their radios relied on precision and attention to detail. Yet as Hermann twisted open the casing of the SCR-508, he was struck by the simplicity of the American design. The radio's components were arranged in a way that was almost too logical, too functional. Everything had its place, and there were no unnecessary complexities. The German radios were often intricate and precise, but this American design was engineered for one thing: durability in the field. He examined the crystal-controlled circuits closely. Unlike the cumbersome German setups, which were prone to overheating or interference, the American system seemed designed to avoid these issues entirely. The crystals inside the SCR-508 were perfectly cut, far more precise than the rough hand-finished crystals that Germans typically used. The level of refinement was startling. The precision with which these crystals had been manufactured was something that Hermann could only marvel at. There was no room for error in their creation. Any flaw in the crystal could cause interference, and yet these components seemed flawless. Hermann's fingers traced the soldered connections, inspecting the quality of the work. The joints were clean, and even with none of the telltale signs of rushed assembly that he had come to associate with battlefield equipment. The American radios were built for reliability, designed to endure the harsh conditions of war without sacrificing functionality. The Germans, on the other hand, had been forced to compromise, focusing on craftsmanship at the expense of ruggedness. This difference in approach became clearer with each passing moment. His hands moved to the SCR-300 walkie-talkie, the iconic American device that had revolutionized communication on the battlefield. Unlike anything in the German arsenal, the SCR-300 was lightweight, portable, and deceptively simple. Hermann turned it over in his hands, feeling the smoothness of its surface, noting how the design seemed perfectly tailored for use by individual soldiers in the field. Its compact size made it easy to carry and operate, But it didn't sacrifice power for portability. The antenna, short and sturdy, was positioned in a way that allowed for a clear signal over considerable distances, something German equipment often struggled with. With a steady hand, Hermann unscrewed the back of the walkie-talkie and peered inside. It was a straightforward layout with fewer components than any German model he had worked on, yet it functioned far better than anything the Wehrmacht had in use. The American radios were designed not only for communication but for coordination, keeping men in constant contact even in the thick of battle. German soldiers often had to rely on runners, messengers, or outdated equipment, all of which introduced inefficiencies that could be fatal. As Hermann continued his inspection, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the American radios and the German fugue systems. The German radios, while competent in their own right, were cumbersome and unreliable in the field. They often required extensive calibration and could only function within certain frequency ranges. The American radios, by contrast, seemed built for adaptability, able to work over a broader range of frequencies with more stable signals. The Americans had taken into account the realities of warfare radios that could be easily set up, operated, and maintained under pressure. The realization began to dawn on Hermann that what he was looking at was more than just a piece of equipment. The American radio systems represented a different approach to war itself, one that embraced mass production, simplicity, and efficiency over the German ideal of handcrafted perfection. It was a paradigm shift that had already begun to reshape the battlefield in ways the Germans hadn't fully anticipated. Hermann moved over to the SCR-299 mobile communications system, which had been used by U.S. command units. It was larger than the other radios, but its design was no less impressive. The system was mobile, able to be transported by truck, and it provided long-range communication. The system used the same crystal-controlled frequency modulation as the other radios, but this was designed for coordination between units, allowing for a higher level of operational integration. He couldn't help but compare it to the German fugue systems. The fugue systems, although an achievement in their own right, had always been designed for specific applications. The SCR-299, by contrast, could be used in a variety of situations, seamlessly linking different units across a wide area. The flexibility of the American system was a luxury the German systems could not afford. Hermann took a step back, letting out a long breath. He had seen enough. The realization was now unmistakable. The United States had outpaced Germany in a field that was perhaps one of the most critical in modern warfare communications. It wasn't just the technology itself that set the Americans apart. It was the ability to mass-produce that technology at an industrial scale. While the Germans relied on quality over quantity, the Americans had leveraged their industrial might to produce these sophisticated systems in overwhelming numbers. This was no longer just a question of engineering, it was a question of logistics and production capacity. The more Hermann thought about it, the more it became clear the radios weren't just a tool. They were a symbol of the larger disparity between the two nations. The United States, with its enormous factories and efficient supply chains, had built a war machine that could sustain itself in a way that Germany's could not. The Germans had been playing a different game, focused on precision and quality, but they had underestimated the power of mass production. It wasn't just the radios that spoke to this disparity. It was every aspect of the American war effort. The tanks, the trucks, the planes, everything had been designed with one goal in mind: to produce as much and as quickly as possible. The Germans, constrained by limited resources and a smaller industrial base, could not hope to keep up with this relentless output. It was a war that had already been decided in factories across the Atlantic. Hermann sat back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling in. This wasn't just about better radios. This was the realization that the war was being fought on an entirely different scale, one that Germany could never match. March 15th, 1943. Tunis, Tunisia. Hermann sat at the desk, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him as he reviewed his notes. He had spent the better part of the past 2 weeks examining the captured American radios, scrutinizing their components, testing their reliability, and making comparisons to the German systems he knew so well. Yet despite all the technical details and data, it was the bigger picture that haunted him. The radios had opened a door into a larger, more uncomfortable truth. Germany was fighting a war it could not win. not because of the bravery of the soldiers, not because of tactical missteps, but because the United States was waging a war on a scale the Germans simply could not match. He picked up the SCR-508 tank radio again, feeling its weight in his hands. It wasn't the best designed radio in terms of engineering. There were certainly elements he would have improved, especially the construction materials, but what it represented, the way it functioned in the chaos of battle, was a revelation. It worked. And it worked reliably. It was not an isolated achievement, but part of a wider network of advanced, mass-produced equipment that kept American forces connected across vast distances. Germany had always prided itself on quality over quantity. It had poured immense effort into making superior weapons, tanks, and radios. But Hermann now saw that the American approach focused on sheer volume, and the ability to equip entire armies with reliable gear was winning the war in ways Germany could never achieve. It was a battle of industrial output, not just battlefield tactics. He placed the SCR-508 back on the table and reached for his notes. His hand trembled slightly as he recorded the numbers again. 30 million radio crystals produced in the United States, compared to fewer than 1 million in Germany. The disparity was staggering. The German manufacturing base was nowhere near large enough to compete with the industrial might of the United States. It wasn't just a technological gap, it was a production gap of monumental proportions. Germany had relied on high-level craftsmanship to make up for the lack of resources, but it was becoming increasingly clear that this method couldn't compete with the American industrial machine. The U.S. factories were churning out tanks, planes, and communication systems by the thousands, while Germany's capacity to produce advanced equipment was severely constrained by a limited workforce, bombings, and dwindling raw materials. This was not just about radios, it was about the American ability to produce war materiel in quantities that Germany could never dream of. Hermann's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the door. He looked up to see another engineer entering the room, a stack of reports in his hand. The engineer placed them down on the table in front of Hermann, nodding silently before stepping back. As Hermann glanced over the reports, he felt the weight of their implications. They were more detailed evaluations of the German Fugue radio systems, along with some field reports of their performance. The contrast could not have been clearer. The Fugue radios, while functional in certain situations, had severe limitations. They could only operate effectively within a narrow frequency range, and their performance in the field was often unreliable, especially under combat conditions. Interference, mechanical failure, and poor signal strength were persistent problems. In stark contrast, the American radios, particularly those using frequency modulation FM, were stable and dependable. They could operate across a much broader frequency spectrum, providing clearer and more reliable communication. Hermann turned the reports over in his mind. The technological gap between the two systems was undeniable. But it wasn't just about the technology, it was about what it represented. The realization struck Hermann with a painful clarity. The war, at least in terms of equipment and logistics, had already been decided. The United States had turned the tide through its unparalleled industrial capabilities. While Germany focused on quality and precision, the Americans were focused on quantity and scalability, and that approach was winning. The U.S. could supply an entire army with radios that worked seamlessly across the battlefield, while Germany was struggling to keep its communication systems operational. Hermann stood up and paced the room, his mind racing. He thought of the vast American factories, the relentless production lines that never stopped. In comparison, Germany's war economy was a house of cards, beautifully crafted but fragile and unsustainable. The sheer scale of American output could not be overstated. This wasn't just a problem for radio technology. It was a problem for every aspect of the war. The United States could produce weapons and equipment at a pace Germany could never match, and that production capacity was now feeding the Allied war machine across every theatre. As he thought through the implications of what he had discovered, Hermann couldn't help but feel a sense of resignation. The capture of these radios had been more than a mere technical intelligence victory. It was a symbolic moment, a moment where the true nature of the conflict had revealed itself. The United States was not just winning battles, they were winning the war of production, and in doing so, They had rendered the Germans' finest efforts irrelevant. The more Hermann considered it, the more it became clear it wasn't the technological superiority of the American radios alone that had made them effective. It was the ability of the United States to mass-produce them. The ability to outpace and outproduce the enemy had become the defining characteristic of the Allied war effort. And as the war continued, it would become apparent that no matter how sophisticated or well-engineered Germany's equipment was, it could never match the scale at which the United States could produce its own. Hermann took a deep breath and sat back down at the table. His mind kept returning to the same thought. The Germans were losing the war not because of their technological inferiority, but because they simply could not compete with the industrial power of the United States. The radios, these unassuming pieces of technology, had exposed a truth that was both undeniable and devastating. The Germans had been outproduced, and that fact would determine the course of the war. The harsh reality settled over him like a cold wave. The war was not just a battle of tactics or courage, it was a battle of industrial might, and the United States had already won. April 2nd, 1943, Tunis, Tunisia. The weight of the discovery hung heavily over Hermann like a shadow that stretched far beyond the laboratory where he had first examined the captured radios. He paced the small, cluttered room, his thoughts consumed by the truth he had uncovered. Germany's radio systems, designed with precision and craftsmanship, were no match for the sheer industrial scale at which the United States could produce its advanced communication equipment. It wasn't just a matter of better technology, it was a matter of overwhelming logistical power. The American war machine, churning out radios, tanks, and aircraft by the thousands, had a decisive advantage that the Germans simply could not overcome. Hermann leaned over his desk, his fingers tapping the surface as his mind replayed the findings of the past weeks. The radios he had studied, the SCR-508, SCR-300, and SCR-299, were marvels of engineering. Yes, but it was their scale of production that made them so effective. The U.S. didn't just build these radios, they mass-produced them, flooding the battlefield with the tools that kept their soldiers connected, their tanks coordinated, and their commanders in constant communication. But as Hermann looked at the reports and technical data in front of him, he realized it wasn't just the radios. It was everything. From the vast factories that churned out endless supplies to the efficient logistics networks that kept the American forces well-stocked and well-equipped, it was clear that the United States' industrial capacity had given them an insurmountable edge. The Germans, for all their engineering expertise, could not compete with the scale at which the Allies were waging war. He glanced at the map of North Africa pinned to the wall, tracing the path of the ongoing campaign. The Battle of Sidi Bouzid had been a significant loss for the Axis, but it was more than just a tactical defeat. It had revealed something much larger. The Germans were fighting an enemy with resources and production capabilities that they could not hope to match. The realization gnawed at him, unsettling and inescapable. The war was being won not on the battlefield, but in the factories of America. As Hermann sat back, the implications of this truth began to settle in. The war was entering a new phase, one where industrial output would dictate the outcome. The Germans had been relying on superior craftsmanship and high-quality engineering to compete with the Allies. But quality alone couldn't win a war when the other side could outproduce you at every turn. The Americans didn't need to build the most advanced tanks or the most precise radios. They only needed to build more of them. And that simple fact had made all the difference. In the coming months, Hermann knew that the German High Command would come to the same conclusion. The capture of the American radios had been more than a mere intelligence windfall. It had been the moment when the Germans first realized that the war was being decided by something other than strategy or tactics. It was being decided by mass production. The United States had the ability to flood the battlefield with superior equipment, and that was a luxury the Germans could never hope to match. Hermann's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was his colleague, engineer Kurt Bauer, who entered with a file in hand. Bauer's face was grave, and his eyes held the same realization that had consumed Hermann in recent days. The two engineers exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Neither of them needed to say it aloud. The war had already been decided by the forces they could not control. Bauer placed the file on the table. It contained field reports from the front detailing the performance of the German radio systems in the latest engagements. The reports were troubling. The Fug radios had failed to perform as expected. They had experienced significant interference, and their limited range had left German forces isolated at critical moments. In contrast, the American radios, which had been used by the same units the Germans had been battling against, had remained operational. They had provided the Allies with the means to coordinate their movements, relay information quickly, and maintain control of the battlefield. Hermann glanced at the reports, his mind racing. The Germans had tried to maintain the illusion of superiority of better engineering and more reliable technology, but these reports confirmed what they had feared: their equipment, while built to last, couldn't compete with the scale and reliability of American production. The difference wasn't just in the radios, it was in everything. The United States had embraced a philosophy of mass production that Germany had ignored, and now the consequences were becoming clear. The German soldiers, isolated and cut off by communication failures, were fighting a war that they could not win. As the Allies continued to build and deliver new equipment by the truckload, the Germans were left to rely on a broken supply chain and dwindling resources. Hermann leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. The war had already shifted in favor of the Allies, long before the German soldiers had even set foot in Tunisia. It wasn't just the American tanks or the planes that overwhelmed the Germans. It was the American ability to produce those tanks, those planes, and those radios in numbers the Germans could never hope to match. The true turning point of the war had not been a specific battle or a single defeat. It had been the realization that the industrial gap between the Axis and the Allies was insurmountable. The Germans had underestimated the scale of American production. They had believed that their superior engineering could overcome any obstacle, but the reality of industrial warfare had shattered that illusion. It was no longer just about what they could build, it was about what the Allies could build in overwhelming quantities. The capture of those radios in Tunisia had been the moment when the Germans first realized the war was not just about fighting on the battlefield, it was about outproducing your enemy, and that was something they could never achieve. Hermann stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the barren landscape of Tunisia. In the distance he could hear the faint rumble of artillery fire, but to him it seemed like background noise to a battle that had already been lost. The war had been decided in factories, not trenches, and that truth, now clear and undeniable, would shape the future of the conflict. The Germans had lost the war not because they had been outmaneuvered, but because they had been outproduced. And as long as the Americans continued to churn out radios, tanks, and planes at an unimaginable scale, the outcome was never in doubt. May 10, 1943. Berlin, Germany. The harshness of the North African campaign was still echoing in the minds of German high command, and reports from the front continued to trickle in, painting a bleak picture. The Allies had made significant advances, and the capture of American equipment, radio systems in particular, had exposed an undeniable truth that was now sinking into the core of the German war effort. The radios, along with the entire industrial apparatus behind them, were a symbol of what Germany could never achieve. Within the Reich's war councils, the conversation had shifted. The initial shock of battlefield defeats had now turned into a broader realization that the war was being lost not because of missteps on the front lines, but because the Germans had been outproduced at every turn. What began as a tactical problem was evolving into a far more strategic one. The sheer scale and reliability of American manufacturing was the decisive factor in the outcome of the war. Back in Berlin, Hermann sat at his desk, a stack of reports and technical evaluations in front of him. He had spent weeks processing the data from the Tunisian campaign, and as he reviewed the documents now, the conclusions seemed inevitable. The radio systems, those seemingly mundane pieces of equipment, had proven to be the tipping point. They weren't just tools of communication. They had been the lifeline of the American war machine, allowing for seamless coordination between soldiers, tanks, and air forces. Meanwhile, the German communication systems, though expertly crafted, had been inadequate for the demands of modern warfare, and their limited production capacity only worsened the situation. Hermann thought back to the early days of the war, when the German military believed that their engineering would be enough to overcome any obstacles. The belief that superior craftsmanship and precision would always win out had been central to the German ethos. But as the war dragged on and the Allies' industrial output surged, it became clear that the Germans had been fighting a war they could never sustain. The United States, with its vast industrial base, had already tipped the balance of the conflict. It wasn't just about technological superiority. It was about having the capacity to produce that technology in staggering quantities. The Germans, constrained by a limited production base and the ongoing strain of aerial bombings, simply couldn't compete. As the reports came in from other fronts, the gap between German and American industrial capabilities became even more apparent. The Allies were outfitting entire divisions with tanks, trucks, radios, and planes, each more advanced and reliable than the last, while Germany could not even meet the demand for its existing equipment. The long-range strategic bombing campaigns over Germany, designed to cripple its manufacturing infrastructure, only added to the problem. The factories that were supposed to fuel the German war effort were being systematically destroyed, and with every bomb that fell, the gap between the Axis and the Allies grew wider. In the wake of these revelations, the German leadership struggled to formulate a response. The traditional focus on quality and craftsmanship was no longer enough to overcome the overwhelming advantage of American mass production. The war was no longer being decided by tactics or individual battles. It was being decided by the relentless output of American factories, and Germany simply couldn't match that scale. Hermann watched as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The Battle of Sidi Bouzid had been a turning point not just for its tactical importance, but for what it revealed about the balance of power in the war. The capture of American radios had laid bare the industrial gap between the two nations, and the Germans were struggling to catch up. They had prided themselves on their engineering excellence, but they had neglected the fundamental truth of modern warfare. The ability to produce and supply weapons and technology in massive quantities was what ultimately determined victory. The realization wasn't confined to the engineers and technical experts. It had begun to permeate the highest levels of German command. As the war continued, the truth became undeniable. Germany had already lost the war of logistics. The Allies' ability to outproduce the Germans on every front, from tanks and aircraft to radios and ammunition, had sealed their fate. Hermann took one last look at the pile of reports before him. The capture of the American radios had been a key moment, but it was only the beginning of a much broader realization. The industrial capacity of the United States had already decided the war. The Germans had been fighting with one hand tied behind their back, trying to maintain an edge through superior craftsmanship, while the Americans overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. The result was inevitable. Across Germany, the High Command was already making plans for the future, but Hermann knew it was too late. The Allied production machine was too vast, too efficient. The German war economy, which had once been the envy of Europe, was now crumbling under the weight of strategic miscalculations and an enemy whose capacity to produce far outstripped their own. The radios that had been captured in Tunisia were more than just pieces of technology. They had been the heralds of a new kind of warfare, one where mass production and logistical superiority determined the outcome. And that was a war the Germans could never win. As the war continued to drag on the lessons of Tunisia, the realization that the United States' industrial might had tipped the balance became a stark truth that shaped German military strategy. The reliance on superior technology, once considered the key to victory, was now obsolete. The future of warfare was not in the quality of the individual weapon, but in the quantity with which it could be produced. For Hermann and many others, the discovery of the American radios had marked the point where the future of the war had been decided. The Germans had failed to adapt to the industrial realities of modern warfare, and that failure would cost them everything.